Take a close look at this picture. What an incredibly dramatic scene. The figure in the center, whom we can only see from behind, is Jesus, or rather, it is his soul. For at that very moment, his body lies dead in a tomb. If you've ever wondered what happened in the 3 days following Christ's death on the cross, here's one possible answer as to what it looked like. Our Lord is busy pulling souls out of an ominous realm, whose existence has always been so controversial that it has since been removed from Catholic doctrine. It was called Limbo. Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy is unquestionably one of the greatest works of literature of all time. The epic poem, written in the 14th century, famously describes the poet's allegorical journey through 3 different realms: Inferno, meaning hell; Purgatorio, purgatory; and Paradiso, heaven. The most famous part is probably his description of hell, into which he descends with his guide, the Roman poet Virgil. Even though many may never have actually read Dante, they are nonetheless familiar with the image of the concentric circles of hell. This fact attests to the immense influence of the Divine Comedy on our thinking. In Dante's work, hell takes the form of a funnel that was created when Lucifer fell from heaven, crashed into the earth, and is now stuck up to his chest in a frozen lake at the center of the earth. This funnel is divided into 9 levels, with the lowest level, the 9th circle, obviously reserved for the most grievous sinners. It is an easy-to-understand concept. Take, for example, the 3rd circle. Here we find those punished for gluttony, that is, those who lost all sense of moderation in eating and drinking during their lifetimes. In the 6th circle, things get more serious. Here we find heretics. The 8th circle is for deceivers and hypocrites, and so on. This raises the question, who resides in the uppermost level? Circle number 1, just below the surface. Before we continue, I'll have to simplify things quite a bit here, so I ask for your patience in advance. You see, the first circle of hell in the Divine Comedy, which Dante refers to as Limbo, is, strictly speaking, a special case in its own right, and has sparked fascinating debates among scholars. For our purposes, however, it serves to give us an overview of the general concept. The term limbo comes from the Latin word limbus, meaning edge, border, or boundary, and is strongly influenced by medieval theology. But the questions underlying this concept are, of course, older. Much older. First, what happens to non-Christians who, although they led virtuous lives, lived in a time or place separate from Christ, and thus could not have known him, such as pagans, including the poet Virgil himself? Strictly speaking, this question does not actually fall into the category of limbo, but Dante simply slipped it in there. Then there is the question of the patriarchs, that is, figures from the Old Testament, including, for example, the prophets, all the way back to Adam and Eve. And finally, what happens to the souls of children who die unbaptized? So welcome to Limbo. Let's take a look around and see what Dante saw. The first thing that stands out is what he didn't see. He saw neither Abraham nor King David, Moses or Noah, nor Adam or Eve. Why? Because after his sacrificial death on the cross, Jesus descended into the underworld during the 3 days following his death, proclaimed the gospel, freed the righteous souls from their prison, and brought them to heaven. This means that the so-called limbus patrum is empty. This is official church teaching to this day, not a doctrine, but a teaching. Well, at least Catholic teaching. If you belong to a Protestant denomination, some of the considerations expressed here may not apply to you anyway. What Dante did see in Limbo, however, were some of the most outstanding figures of antiquity, including Aristotle, Socrates, Homer, and even Julius Caesar. The reason is simple. Although they were all born before Jesus, they lived, at least according to Dante, virtuous lives, and were therefore not direct candidates for hell. But then, after spending some time in Limbo, they had the unique opportunity to see Jesus on his descent into hell, and yet refused to accept him. And so, they remained stuck there. Again, I'm oversimplifying, but only a little. Now, before we turn to the question of unbaptized children, here's a brief explanation of the punishments these great men of antiquity must endure for all eternity, because it's truly enlightening. You see, they don't suffer any physical torture at all. The place where the virtuous pagans live is actually quite peaceful, almost comfortable, if it weren't for this one thing, a leaden melancholy that hangs over everything. It stems from an unrecognized longing for God that will never be fulfilled. Dante calls this state sorrow without pain. In a word, hopelessness. And that brings us to unbaptized children. Is there hope for them? Dante mentions the children in Limbo only in passing, perhaps a sign that even back then, he wasn't entirely comfortable with this seemingly unforgiving concept. Here we have arrived at the real question regarding traditional limbo. Remember, the limbo of the patriarchs no longer exists. It is completely empty. Theologically speaking, there is now only the limbus infantium, the limbo of infants. It all begins with St. Augustine and his doctrine of original sin. This led to the belief that children who die unbaptized would inevitably go straight to hell. Although this was considered theologically sound, attempts were made over the centuries to soften this teaching as it simply sounded too cruel. Among those who sought to do so was the Church's greatest teacher, Thomas Aquinas. And yet Augustine's view remained more or less the official position of the Church. The idea, which originated in the Middle Ages, that there must be a place on the edge of hell where souls dwell who are excluded from heaven through no fault of their own, arose, so to speak, out of the need to offer some comfort at the thought of children facing eternal damnation. Fast forward to 2007, the International Theological Commission publishes a document titled The Hope of Salvation for Infants Who Die Without Being Baptized. It is a nuanced report, and to be fair, it does not reject the theory of limbo. But it opens up the possibility that the souls of unbaptized deceased infants may now go directly to paradise. The report was endorsed that same year by Pope Benedict XVI, not exactly a theological lightweight. So when I mentioned in the intro that the Church has abandoned the concept of limbo, I was referring to the limbo of infants. And call me what you will, but personally, I think that's a good thing. Thanks so much for watching, and see you next time.